Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle journey through the shadows of history. Hey, imagine yourself transported to Victorian London at precisely 3 o'clock in the morning, when the city breathes differently than it does in daylight hours. The fog hangs thick and heavy, carrying with it the accumulated weight of 1,000,000 lives, pressed together in narrow streets and cramped quarters. This is not the London of gaslit drawing rooms and elegant carriages that fills our collective imagination, but the London of the laboring poor, where survival was measured not in years, but in the hours between one shift and the next. You find yourself standing on a street corner where the cobblestones are slick with moisture that might be dew, but is more likely the accumulated grime of industry and human habitation. The air tastes of coal smoke and something else, something organic and unsettling that speaks to the proximity of too many people living in too little space. This is a world where the concept of privacy was as foreign as the idea of leisure, where every moment of rest was borrowed against tomorrow's exhaustion. If you want to help me to keep doing these videos, please consider subscribing to the channel and hit the like button. It motivates and helps me keep bringing videos in this format. If you'd like to hear about a specific topic, leave a comment below, and I'll show you in the video when your topic is chosen. Picture yourself climbing a narrow staircase, each step creaking under your weight as you ascend into the heart of a Victorian lodging house. The banister beneath your hand feels sticky with the accumulated touch of countless desperate palms, and the air grows thicker with each floor you climb. You are entering a world where space itself has become a commodity more precious than gold, where even the luxury of lying down to sleep must be negotiated, scheduled, and often shared with strangers whose names you will never learn. The door before you opens onto a room no larger than a modern walk-in closet, yet within these cramped confines, the entire drama of working-class survival plays out in shifts as regular as the tides. The walls are stained with moisture that seeps through the cheap mortar, creating patterns that might be beautiful if they weren't evidence of the building's slow decay. The single window, grimy with coal soot, offers a view of nothing but the identical brick wall of the building next door, so close you could reach out and touch it if the window could be opened, but you cannot. The centerpiece of this modest space is a bed that has seen more bodies than a doctor's examination table, its mattress compressed by years of use into something that barely deserves the name. This is what the residents call a hotbed, not because of its temperature, so the accumulated warmth of human bodies does linger in the thin fabric, but because it never truly cools, never remains empty long enough to lose the impression of the last person who lay upon it. The system is brutally efficient in its simplicity. 3 people share this single sleeping space, each working an 8-hour shift, each returning to collapse into the still warm depression left by their predecessor. You watch as the morning shift worker stumbles from the bed, his movements slow and deliberate, like a man moving underwater, his eyes bearing the glazed look of someone who has not truly rested in months. His clothes, which he has slept in because undressing would waste precious minutes and because he owns no night clothes anyway, on his frame like fabric draped over a scarecrow. The morning air holds a chill that seems to seep through the walls themselves, but he moves with the mechanical precision of someone for whom comfort has become an abstract concept, relevant to the business of surviving another day. Behind him, already stirring in the corner of the room where he has been, waiting his turn, the night shift worker prepares to claim his 8 hours of horizontal existence. There is no conversation between them, no acknowledgement beyond a grunt that might be greeting or farewell, or simply the sound of exhaustion made audible. These men exist in parallel universes of labor, their lives intersecting only in the shared warmth of soiled bedding and the common understanding that this arrangement, however degrading, represents a step up from sleeping in doorways or under bridges where the police might find you. The third member of this involuntary trinity The evening shift worker has already departed for his labor, leaving behind only the faint impression of his body in the single chair that serves as the room's only other furniture. This chair, like everything else in the space, serves multiple purposes. It is dining room table, desk, dresser, and footrest, depending on the needs of whoever happens to be occupying the room at any given moment. Personal possessions are few and carefully guarded, kept in small bundles. It can be moved quickly if circumstances require a sudden departure. The ritual of transition from bed to factory begins with the donning of boots that have walked so many miles that their original shape has molded itself to the unique geography of their wearer's feet. These boots, patched and repatched until they are more repair than original material, represent both the tools of survival and its symbols. They will carry their owner through streets that test the endurance of leather and sole, across factory floors, slick with oil and worse substances, through conditions that would destroy a modern shoe in a matter of days. The factory bell that will summon thousands of workers to their posts has not yet sounded, but its approach hangs in the air like an executioner's axe, marking time not in hours and minutes, but in the rhythm of industrial necessity. When it rings, it will cut through the morning fog with the authority of absolute power, reaching into every cramped room, every shared bed, every corner where the working poor attempt to steal a few moments of rest. That bell represents something more than a simple call to work. It is the voice of a system that has reduced human beings to components in a vast machine, interchangeable parts that can be replaced when they wear out. The worker pulls on a thin jacket that provides more psychological comfort than physical warmth, its fabric worn thin by countless washings in water that was never quite clean. Around his neck, he wraps a scarf that once might have been white, but has long since surrendered to the perpetual soot that settles on everything in this part of London like snow that never melts. This scarf serves not just as protection against the morning chill, but as a filter for air that carries the accumulated exhalations of a city powered by coal and ambition in equal measure. His breakfast, if it can be dignified with such a name, consists of bread that is past its prime and tea so weak it might be mistaken for colored water. The bread is not moldy, which places it in the category of luxury goods within its limited economy. And the tea, while lacking the strength to wake the dead, at least provides the illusion of warmth in his belly. He eats mechanically, not from hunger, though that is a constant companion, but from the understanding that his body requires fuel to perform the labor that will earn him the right to return to this room, this bed, this existence that falls somewhere between living and merely not dying as he prepares to leave this sanctuary of shared misery for the different misery of factory work. The morning light, such as it is, begins to seep through the grimy window. This light has traveled through layers of coal smoke and industrial haze to reach this room, arriving pale and tired, as if it too has been worn down by the weight of urban existence. It illuminates a space that tells the story of Victorian progress from the perspective of those who paid its human cost. A room that serves as both shelter and trap, home and prison, the last refuge of those who have been squeezed to the very margins of survival. The factory bell sounds now, its bronze voice cutting through the morning air with mechanical precision, and you watch as thousands of similar figures emerge from similar rooms throughout this part of the city. They move like an army of the dispossessed, unified not by common but by common necessity, their individual stories subsumed into the larger narrative of industrial labor. Each step they take on the cobblestone streets echoes with the sound of a civilization built on the foundation of human endurance, a testament to both the resilience of the human spirit and the terrible price extracted by unrestrained capitalism. The fog swirls around these moving figures, bracing them like a familiar friend who offers comfort without warmth, concealment without protection. In this fog, all distinctions blur, except the most fundamental one: those who own the means of production, and those who must sell their bodies to survive another day. The worker you have been observing disappears into this mist, becoming one thread in a tapestry woven from exhaustion and necessity, hope and despair, the individual human story absorbed into the larger flow of historical inevitability. Yet, within this absorption, something persists that speaks to the irreducible dignity of human existence, even under conditions designed to crush that dignity. These workers may be cogs in an industrial machine, but they remain human beings with dreams deferred rather than destroyed, with love that persists despite exhaustion, with humor that survives even the most grinding circumstances. The bed they share, degrading as it is, still represents home to someone. The room they occupy, cramped as it may be, still offers shelter from a world even more hostile than the one they have created within its walls. The morning shift begins in earnest now, and the city transforms from a place of individual struggle to a vast engine of collective labor. Each worker a single cylinder in an economic machine that spans continents and reshapes the world according to its imperatives. Follow now as our worker makes his way through the factory gates, those imposing iron barriers that separate the world of labor from the world of the street, though both worlds share the same atmosphere of struggle and endurance. The gates themselves tell a story in their construction, heavy, utilitarian, designed not for beauty, but for the containment of human energy, channeling it toward productive purposes with the efficiency of a funnel directing water toward a water wheel. Beyond these gates lies a universe governed by different laws than those that operate in the natural world. A place where time moves not according to the sun's passage, but according to the rhythm of machinery that never sleeps. The factory floor stretches before you like a cathedral dedicated to the worship of production, its ceiling lost in shadows that dance with the movement of leather belts and spinning wheels. The air here possesses a weight that seems to press down upon every surface, thick with particles of cotton dust, metal filings, and the microscopic debris of constant manufacturing. This atmosphere enters the lungs of every worker like a slow poison, accumulating day by day, year by year, until breathing itself becomes a conscious effort rather than the automatic function it was designed to be, the machinery that dominates. This space operates with a hypnotic regularity that might be beautiful if it were not so relentlessly demanding of human attention. Each machine requires constant vigilance, as the gap between focused concentration and serious injury measures no more than the width of a single moment's distraction. The workers move among these mechanical beasts with the careful grace of dancers, performing a choreography where a single misstep can result in the loss of fingers, hands, or worse. The constant noise creates a sonic environment that makes conversation impossible, scriting each worker within a bubble of industrial sound that gradually damages the delicate mechanisms of hearing while simultaneously masking the approach of danger. Your worker takes his position at a machine that has already been running for hours. Its surface is warm with the heat generated by constant friction in the accumulated warmth of the workers who have tended it. Through the night shift, the handover between shifts occurs without ceremony or instruction, as the machine's operation has been simplified to the point where human intelligence becomes almost irrelevant to its function. The worker's role reduces to that of a highly sophisticated sensor, monitoring the machine's operation for the subtle variations that might indicate malfunction, feeding raw materials into its hungry mechanisms, and removing finished products with the mechanical precision of an automaton. The floor beneath his feet is liquid oil that has been tracked from machine to machine by countless boots, represents a constant hazard that demands a portion of his attention even as the machinery demands the rest. This oil, mixed with water that seeps through the building's inadequate roof and various other fluids that leak from the manufacturing process, creates a surface that challenges even the most careful walker. The workers develop a distinctive gait over time, a shuffling movement that maximizes contact with the floor while minimizing the risk of a slip that could send stem tumbling into the path of moving machinery or simply result in a fall that damages bodies already stressed to their breaking point. The light that illuminates this industrial landscape comes not from the sun, which remains largely irrelevant to the factory's operation, but from gas flames that flicker with the inconsistency of their fuel supply and cast dancing shadows that can make stationary objects appear to move. These shadows play tricks on eyes, already strained by the constant need to monitor machinery, creating an environment where visual perception becomes unreliable just when accuracy matters most. Workers learn to trust their other senses, developing an almost supernatural ability to detect changes in the sound or vibration of the machines that might indicate impending malfunction. The heat generated by so much machinery operating in such close proximity creates a microclimate within the factory that bears little relationship to the weather outside. In winter, this heat might be welcome if it were not accompanied by the suffocating quality of air that has been breathed and rebreathed by hundreds of workers. Care that carries not just the warmth of human bodies, but the accumulated exhalations, perspiration, and other biological products of people working at the very limits of their physical capacity. In summer, this same heat becomes a torment that saps strength and concentration, turning the factory floor into something resembling the conditions described in religious texts as appropriate for the punishment of the damned. The rhythm of factory work creates a trance-like state in those who perform it, psychological adaptation to conditions that would otherwise prove unbearable to the conscious mind. The worker you observe has learned to divide his attention between the immediate demands of his machine and a kind of mental retreat that allows his spirit to survive the grinding repetition of industrial labor. This division of consciousness represents a remarkable feat of human adaptability, but it comes at a cost that accumulates over time like the dust in his lungs, gradually eroding the connections between his inner life and his daily existence. The brief breaks that punctuate the workday arrive with the irregularity of mercy in a harsh world. Their timing determined not by human need, but by the requirements of the manufacturing process. When these moments of respite do come, workers gather in small groups near the factory's few windows, desperate for a glimpse of natural light and a breath of air that has not been processed through the lungs of machines and men. The conversation during these breaks, when conversation is possible over the reduced but still considerable noise of the machinery, consists largely of the exchange of information essential to survival, which machines have been acting irregularly, which supervisors are in particularly foul moods, news of accidents or injuries that serve as reminders of the constant presence of danger. The food consumed during these breaks bears little resemblance to what might be called a meal in more comfortable circumstances. Bread and cheese, when cheese can be afforded, supplemented by whatever can be purchased from the vendors who position themselves outside the factory gates, knowing that hunger makes even the most questionable food appealing. The water available for drinking comes from sources that would horrify modern sensibilities, but the workers have long since learned to ignore the taste and color of liquid that at least serves the function of preventing dehydration, even if it cannot be trusted to prevent disease. The afternoon hours bring their own particular challenges as exhaustion begins to accumulate in muscles and joints that have been performing repetitive motions since before dawn. The worker's movements become more deliberate, his responses slower, his margin for error correspondingly smaller, just as fatigue makes errors more likely. This is when accidents most commonly occur, when the gap between human limitation and mechanical demand becomes most apparent. The more experienced workers develop strategies for managing this dangerous period, techniques for maintaining alertness when the body cries out for rest, methods for conserving energy without compromising the vigilance that keeps them alive and whole. The supervisors who move through this mechanical landscape possess an authority that derives not from expertise or wisdom, but from their position within the factory's hierarchy. It's their power to hire and fire, representing the difference between survival and destitution for the workers under their command. These men, themselves products of the same system that grinds down the workers they oversee, often display the particular cruelty of those who have escaped the worst conditions only by accepting responsibility for maintaining them. Their presence adds another layer of stress to an environment already saturated with tension, as workers must monitor not only their machines, but also the movements and moods of those who hold their economic lives in their hands. The dust that fills the factory air settles on everything, creating a patina that speaks to the accumulation of industrial time in a space where natural time has been suspended. This dust coats the workers' clothing, penetrates their skin, and creates patterns on surfaces that tell the story of the factory's operation as clearly as tree rings tell the story of seasons. The workers themselves become part of this industrial landscape, their bodies adapted to conditions that would have been unimaginable to their ancestors. Their lungs processing air that carries the particulate matter of progress. Their hands shaped by the constant repetition of motions, designed not for human comfort, but for productive efficiency. As the day wears on and the worker's shift approaches its end, the factory floor takes on a different quality. The machinery, seeming to pulse with an energy that has been fed by human effort and now radiates back into the space like heat from a forge. The worker moves through his final hours with a mixture of anticipation and dread, knowing that the end of his shift brings the promise of rest, but also the certainty that tomorrow will bring a return to this same space, these same machines, this same grinding routine that defines his existence more completely than family, friendship, or any of the other relationships that might flourish in a world with more room for human development. The transition between shifts occurs with the same mechanical precision that characterizes every other aspect of factory operation. Workers filing out through the same gates that admitted them 12 hours earlier are places immediately taken by others whose lives follow the same pattern, whose bodies will absorb the same punishment, whose spirits will be tested by the same relentless demands. The factory never stops, never pauses, never acknowledges the human cost of its operation, except when that cost becomes so visible that it threatens the efficiency of production itself. As a worker emerges from the factory gates into what passes for evening air in this part of London, he encounters an atmosphere that seems to assault every sense simultaneously. Sensory experience so overwhelming that newcomers to the city often find themselves physically ill within moments of their first deep breath. This is the London of the Great Stink city, where the very air has become a visible entity. It's thick with the accumulated byproducts of human civilization pressed too tightly together, where breathing itself becomes an act of endurance rather than the automatic function nature intended it to be. The smell that greets him is not a single odor, but a complex symphony of decay, a layered composition that speaks to every aspect of urban life in an age before proper sanitation. The primary note in this olfactory orchestra comes from the Thames, that great river that has been transformed from a source of life into a repository for everything the city wishes to forget. The river carries not just water, but the liquid waste of millions of people, the runoff from countless industries, the decomposing remains of animals that have died in the streets, and substances that defy easy categorization but contribute their own distinctive notes to the overall bouquet of urban decay. But the Thames, horrible as its contribution may be, represents only the foundation upon which other odors build their assault on the senses. The streets themselves exhale their own particular perfume, a mixture of horse manure that has been ground into the cobblestones by countless wheels and hooves, human waste that has been deposited in corners and doorways by those who have no other option. and the accumulated garbage of a city that has not yet developed adequate systems for dealing with the byproducts of its own existence. This street-level aroma rises and mingles with the descending emissions from thousands of chimneys, creating an atmospheric cocktail that seems to coat the inside of the mouth, throat, with each breath. The worker pulls his thin scarf higher around his face, not because it offers any real protection against the assault on his senses, but because the familiar gesture provides a psychological barrier between himself and the overwhelming reality of his environment. The fabric of the scarf, already saturated with the odors of factory work, now begins to absorb the different but equally challenging aromas of the street, creating a personal atmosphere that follows him like a cloud of industrial and urban decay. This scarf, like every piece of clothing he owns, will never be truly clean again, will never lose the accumulated scent of a life lived in the margins of industrial civilization. The fog that hangs over the city serves not as concealment, but as a concentrator, trapping the various emissions close to the ground where they can achieve maximum impact on those unfortunate enough to breathe them. This fog, yellow-brown with the smoke of countless coal fires, moves with a sluggish quality that suggests it has absorbed so much particulate matter that it has achieved a density approaching that of liquid. Walking through this atmospheric soup requires a conscious effort, as if the very air has developed a resistance to human movement, a viscosity that makes every step feel like progress through some medium heavier than air but lighter than water. The worker's journey home takes him through streets that tell the story of London's rapid growth without adequate planning, where buildings have been erected with more attention to immediate profit than to long-term habitability. The structures that line his route lean against each other like tired old men seeking mutual support, their foundations having settled unevenly in soil that was never properly prepared for the weight of urban construction. These buildings weep moisture constantly, not the clean moisture of natural precipitation, but a grimy condensation that carries with it the accumulated filth of their surfaces, creating rivulets of liquid dirt that stain everything they touch. The cobblestones beneath his feet have been polished to a treacherous smoothness by the constant traffic of carts, carriages, and pedestrians, their surface made more dangerous by the layer of organic matter that never quite dries in the perpetual dampness of London's climate. Each step requires careful consideration, as a slip on these slick stones could result in immersion in substances that are better left unexamined too closely. The worker has learned to read the subtle variations in the street's surface, to identify the patches where the cobblestones have been displaced by the passage of heavy vehicles, creating pools where the most noxious liquids collect and concentrate. The sounds that accompany his journey home create an urban symphony that never quite resolves into harmony, a constant cacophony of wheels on stone, voices raised in anger or desperation, the crying of children who have learned too early that comfort is not something they can expect from the world. This sonic landscape reflects the compression of too many lives into too little space, the inevitable result of human beings forced to live in closer proximity than social animals were designed to endure. The worker has learned to filter this noise, to extract from it only the information essential to his survival, while allowing the rest to fade into a background hum that defines urban existence. The people he encounters on his journey represent every stage of the struggle for survival in industrial London, from children who have never known any environment other than the city's harsh embrace to elderly individuals who have somehow managed to survive decades of conditions that seem designed to prevent such longevity. Each face tells a story of adaptation to circumstances that would have been unimaginable to previous generations, each expression reflecting the particular combination of resignation and determination that characterizes those who have learned to extract what small pleasures they can from lives that offer few opportunities for genuine happiness. The shops and stalls that line the streets cater to an economy of desperation, offering goods that range from the merely inferior to the actively dangerous. Food vendors sell items that might once have been fresh, but have now achieved a state of preservation through methods that owe more to chemistry than to culinary art. Clothing merchants, offer garments that have been worn by unknown numbers of previous owners, each piece carrying the accumulated history of bodies that have struggled against the same conditions that now challenge the current wearer. The very concept of newness becomes a luxury that exists primarily in the imagination, as everything in this environment bears the marks of previous use, previous ownership, previous lives lived under similar circumstances. The worker pauses occasionally during his journey, not from choice, but from necessity, as his body protests the combination of 12 hours of factory labor and the additional challenge of breathing air that seems designed to test the limits of human endurance. These brief stops allow him to observe the life of the street with a clarity that constant movement would make impossible, to witness the small dramas of survival that play out on every corner. He sees mothers attempting to keep children clean in an environment that seems to soil everything it touches, sees men gathering in small groups to share information about work opportunities or to pool their meager resources for purchases that none could afford individually. The architecture of survival reveals itself in the details of how people have adapted their behavior to their environment, in the way they move through spaces that were never designed for human comfort, in the strategies they have developed for maintaining dignity under conditions that seem designed to strip away everything that makes life worth living. The worker observes these adaptations with the eye of someone who has made similar accommodations, who understands the complex calculus involved in deciding which discomforts to endure and which to resist, which compromises to accept, and which lines never to cross. The gradually failing light of evening adds another layer of challenge to navigation. The streets that are dangerous enough in daylight, as the gas lamps that provide illumination, cast more shadows than they dispel, creating pools of uncertain light separated by regions of near total darkness. These shadowed areas become refuges for activities that cannot bear scrutiny, spaces where the normal rules of social interaction are suspended in favor of more primitive arrangements. The worker adjusts his route to avoid the darkest corners, while acknowledging that in a city where darkness is never far away, complete avoidance of danger represents an impossible goal. The transition from the industrial district to the residential area where he maintains his claim on 1/3 of a bed brings no relief from the assault on his senses. Only a change in a particular combination of odors and sounds that define his environment. The residential streets carry their own distinctive perfume, one dominated by the smell of too many people living in too little space, of cooking conducted with inadequate ventilation, of laundry that could never quite achieve cleanliness in water that was never clean to begin with. This domestic aroma mingles with the industrial emissions that follow him from the factory district, creating a personal atmosphere that reflects the entirety of his daily existence. The building that contains his shared room looms before him, like a vertical city, its multiple floors housing dozens of individuals. His lives intersect only in their common struggle against the same hostile environment. The stairs that lead to his floor creak under his weight with sounds that speak to the building's structural fatigue, its gradual surrender to the constant stress of supporting more weight than it was designed to bear. Each floor he climbs carries its own particular combination of sounds and smells, evidence of the lives being lived behind doors that offer privacy only in the most technical sense. As the thin walls permit the transfer of sound, smell, and even light between living spaces that were never intended to provide true separation, the hallway that leads to his room stretches before him like a tunnel, its walls stained with moisture that seems to seep through the building's fabric, like perspiration through clothing, creating patterns that tell the story of the structure's slow decay. The air in this confined space has achieved a density that speaks to its having been breathed and rebreathed by countless individuals, each exhalation adding its own contribution to an atmosphere that seems to resist the introduction of any fresh element. The worker moves through this environment with the efficiency of long practice, his body automatically adjusting to conditions that would challenge a newcomer's ability to function. The door to his room, when he finally reaches, it represents both the end of his journey and the beginning of his brief respite before the cycle begins again. Behind this door lies the bed that he will share with two strangers, the space that represents his only claim on privacy in a world that seems designed to eliminate such luxuries. As he prepares to enter this sanctuary of shared misery, the worker carries with him not just the physical exhaustion of his labor, but the accumulated sensory assault of his journey through a city that seems determined to test the limits of human adaptability. In the summer of 1858, the great River Thames achieved a notoriety that would echo through history as one of the most spectacular failures of urban planning ever recorded. A catastrophe so complete in its assault on human dignity that it forced even the most reluctant politicians to acknowledge that the vestiges of civilization itself were dissolving in a tide of human waste. The river that had once been the lifeblood of London, carrying trade and prosperity to the heart of the empire, had been transformed into something that defied the normal vocabulary of disgust, a liquid repository of urban decay that seemed to mock every pretension of Victorian progress and refinement. Picture yourself standing on one of London's bridges during that infamous summer, attempting to peer through the thick, yellowish fog that rises from the water's surface like the breath of some subterranean demon. The fog itself tells a story of chemical processes that should not occur in nature, reactions between organic matter and industrial waste that produce gases unknown to the clean countryside, vapors that seem to possess a malevolent intelligence in their persistence and their ability to penetrate every corner of the city. This is not the gentle mist that rises from clean water on cool mornings, but something that seems to have substance and weight. Something that clings to clothing and skin like a living thing determined to share its corruption with everything. It touches the water below, wet when it can be glimpsed through the noxious cloud that hovers above its surface. It bears no resemblance to any liquid that might reasonably be called water. The Thames has achieved a consistency somewhere between soup and sewage, its surface broken not by the clean ripples of flowing water, but by islands of solid matter that defy easy identification. Floating masses of decomposing organic material that rise and fall with the tide like the breathing of some vast, dying creature. The color defies description in any terms that might be used for natural phenomena. A brownish green that seems to shift and change as if the liquid itself were alive, pulsing with the accumulated filth of millions of human beings who have no choice but to deposit their waste in the only receptacle the city has provided. The smell that rises from this aquatic nightmare penetrates consciousness like a physical assault. A combination of odors so complex and overwhelming that the human mind struggles to process the individual components of what quickly becomes a totalizing sensory experience. The base note comes from human waste, of course. The accumulated sewage of a city whose population has far outstripped its capacity to dispose of the byproducts of human existence in any manner that might be considered sanitary. But this foundational horror serves only as the platform upon which other aromas build their contribution to the overall symphony of decay. Industrial waste adds its own distinctive voice to this olfactory chorus, as factories along the rivers, banks have found it convenient to dispose of their chemical byproducts in the same receptacle that receives human waste, creating combinations of substances that were never intended to exist in nature. The resulting chemical reactions produce gases that seem designed by some malevolent chemist to test the outer limits of human tolerance. vapors that burn the eyes and throat while simultaneously attacking the more delicate mechanisms of smell and taste, leaving those who breathe them with a sensation that lingers long after exposure has ended. The decomposing remains of animals contribute their own notes to this macabre composition, as horses, dogs, cats, and livestock that have died in the cities. Streets often find their way into the river through the various channels and sewers that connect London's land-based waste to its aquatic dumping ground. These organic materials, in various stages of decay, add a sweetish undertone to the overall aroma that somehow manages to be more disturbing than the sharper chemical odors. Perhaps because it speaks so directly to the proximity of death in an environment where life struggles to maintain its hold. The newspapers of the day struggled to find language adequate to convey the magnitude of the crisis, their reporters reaching for metaphors that might help readers understand an experience that exceeded the normal boundaries of urban discomfort. The Times described the river as a vast open sewer, a phrase that quickly entered common usage, but somehow failed to capture the true horror of a waterway that had become something unprecedented in human experience. A liquid environment so thoroughly corrupted that it seemed to exist in defiance of natural law. Other publications attempted more colorful descriptions, comparing the Thames to various substances known for their offensive properties, but inevitably fell short of conveying the reality of a smell so powerful that it could be detected miles from the river's banks. The crisis reached its peak during the parliamentary session of 1858, when the windows of the Houses of Parliament, situated inconveniently close to the Thames, had to be hung with sheets soaked in lime in a desperate attempt to filter the air sufficiently to allow the business of government to continue. The sight of Britain's most powerful men, the architects of an empire that spanned the globe, reduced to breathing through improvised masks while conducting the affairs of state, provided a striking illustration of how thoroughly the city's waste management crisis had democratized misery across all levels of society. Members of Parliament, accustomed to the deference that their positions commanded in other aspects of their lives, found themselves as helpless as the poorest residents of the city's slums when confronted with an atmospheric assault that recognized no distinctions of class or privilege. The Speaker of the House was forced to suspend sessions when the smell became so overwhelming that coherent debate became impossible, creating the surreal spectacle of the world's most powerful legislative body, rendered impotent by the accumulated excrement of its own citizens. The medical community of London watched this unfolding crisis with a mixture of professional fascination and personal horror. The prevailing theories of disease transmission suggested that the noxious vapors rising from the Thames carried with them the seeds of epidemic illness that could sweep through the city's population with devastating efficiency. The miasma theory, which held that disease spread through corrupt air rather than through direct contact, seemed to find perfect confirmation in the yellow clouds that billowed from the river's surface, creating an atmosphere that appeared to pulse with malevolent life. Physicians who ventured close to the river for purposes of study found themselves overwhelmed by symptoms that ranged from simple nausea to more serious respiratory distress, leading to urgent recommendations that citizens avoid the riverside areas entirely during the worst periods of the crisis. The irony of a city built around its river becoming uninhabitable near that same river was lost on no one, creating a sense of urban dysfunction so complete that it challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which Victorian confidence was built. The working classes, who had no choice but to continue their daily labor regardless of atmospheric conditions, developed various strategies for survival in an environment that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. Street vendors began selling crude masks made from cloth and various filtering materials, though these provided more psychological comfort than actual protection against vapors that seemed to penetrate every barrier the human ingenuity could devise. Workers who labored near the river reported symptoms that included persistent headaches, respiratory irritation, and a metallic taste that lingered for hours after exposure had ended. The economic impact of the crisis extended far beyond the immediate discomfort experienced by London's residents, as business activities that depended on river transport found themselves severely curtailed by conditions that made normal commerce impossible. Ship captains reported that their crews became violently ill when required to work in close proximity to the water, leading to delays and cancellations that rippled through the complex network of trade relationships that connected London to the rest of the world. Insurance companies began to factor the river's condition into their calculations, creating new categories of risk that reflected the unprecedented nature of the crisis. Foreign visitors to London, accustomed to the normal challenges of urban life, but unprepared for the specific horror of the Thames situation, provided some of the most vivid contemporary accounts of the crisis. Their outsiders' perspectives capturing details that residents had learned to ignore through sheer necessity. A French diplomat wrote to his superiors that London had achieved a level of urban decay that exceeded anything he had encountered in his extensive travels, comparing the city unfavorably to the most squalid quarters of medieval towns he had visited in the remotest parts of Europe. The religious community struggled to find theological frameworks adequate to address a crisis that seemed to challenge fundamental assumptions about divine providence and human progress, with some ministers interpreting the situation as divine punishment for the sins of urban excess, while others focused on the moral obligation to address conditions that caused such widespread suffering. Church attendance in riverside parishes declined dramatically as the smell made even abbreviated services unbearable, leading to the unprecedented step of relocating some congregations to temporary facilities away from the river's influence. Children, whose smaller bodies and developing respiratory systems made them particularly vulnerable to the effects of the corrupted atmosphere, became the subjects of intense parental anxiety as families struggled to maintain normal routines in conditions that seemed to threaten their offspring's basic health and development. Schools in riverside areas reported significant increases in absenteeism as parents kept their children indoors during the worst periods, creating an educational crisis that compounded the public health emergency. The psychological impact of living in an environment where the very air seemed contaminated with decay affected different segments of the population in different ways, with some individuals developing a kind of fatalistic acceptance of conditions they could not change, while others experienced a growing sense of rage at the systematic failures that had created such an unprecedented crisis. The shared experience of breathing poisoned air created a kind of perverse solidarity among London's residents, a common understanding that transcended class boundaries, while simultaneously highlighting the different resources available to different groups for coping with environmental disaster. As the summer of 1858 progressed and the crisis showed no signs of natural resolution, it became clear that the situation had moved beyond the realm of temporary inconvenience into something that threatened the very foundations of urban civilization, creating conditions that challenged every assumption about the possibility of organizing human society on the scale that London had achieved. The Thames had become more than a polluted river. It had become a symbol of the darker possibilities inherent in industrial progress, a liquid manifestation of all the unintended consequences that could flow from rapid change pursued without adequate consideration of its long-term implications. Into this landscape of liquid despair stepped a figure whose name would become synonymous with the transformation of urban infrastructure. Though at the time of his appointment, Joseph William Bazalgette appeared to most observers as simply another civil engineer tasked with addressing a problem that had defeated every previous attempt at solution. Born into a world where engineering was beginning to emerge as a profession capable of reshaping the physical foundations of human society, Bazalgette possessed a combination of technical knowledge and political acumen that would prove essential to navigating the complex challenges of implementing change on a scale that had never before been attempted in human history. The man who would ultimately save London from drowning in its own waste began his career during an era when the very concept of systematic urban planning remained largely theoretical. When cities grew according to the immediate needs of commerce and industry rather than any comprehensive vision of human habitation that took into account the long-term consequences of rapid population growth. Bazalgette's early training in engineering had exposed him to the mathematical principles that govern the movement of fluids through constructed channels. But no amount of theoretical knowledge could have prepared him for the political and logistical challenges involved in convincing a reluctant government to invest in infrastructure that would benefit future generations rather than providing immediate returns to contemporary investors. The appointment of Bazalgette as chief engineer to the Metropolitan Board of Works in 1856 placed him at the center of a bureaucratic structure that had been created specifically to address the mounting crisis of urban sanitation. Though the board itself possessed limited authority and even more limited funding to implement the sweeping changes that the situation demanded, the position required him to navigate between the competing interests of property owners who resisted any expenditure that might reduce their immediate profits, politicians who feared the electoral consequences of supporting expensive public works projects, and public health advocates who demanded immediate action regardless of cost or complexity. The technical challenges that confronted Bazalgette as he began to develop his comprehensive plan for London's sewage system would have daunted an engineer of lesser imagination and determination. As the city's existing infrastructure had evolved haphazardly over centuries, creating a maze of interconnected waterways, drainage channels, and waste disposal systems that defied any systematic analysis. The gradual slope of London's terrain, while providing natural drainage toward the Thames, also meant that any comprehensive sewer system would need to move vast quantities of liquid waste across relatively small changes in elevation, requiring pumping stations and engineering solutions that pushed the boundaries of contemporary technology. The scale of the undertaking that Bazalgette envisioned exceeded anything that had been attempted in the history of urban construction, involving the excavation of tunnels and channels that would extend for hundreds of miles beneath the city that could not afford to stop functioning during the construction process. The engineering calculations required to ensure that sewage would flow efficiently through pipes and tunnels of varying sizes and elevations demanded a level of mathematical precision that had rarely been applied to projects of such magnitude, as even small errors in gradient or capacity could result in backups and overflows that would recreate the very problems. The system was designed to solve the materials required for construction presented their own complex challenges, as the project would consume millions of bricks manufactured to specifications that had never been tested on such a scale, along with quantities of iron, concrete, and other construction materials that would strain the productive capacity of Britain's industrial infrastructure. Bazalgette's specifications for the bricks alone required innovations in manufacturing techniques, as standard building materials would not withstand the chemical environment created by flowing sewage, necessitating the development of new compositions and firing techniques that could resist the corrosive effects of the waste. They would be required to contain the political dimension of Bazalgette's challenge, proved in many ways more complex than the technical obstacles, as his comprehensive plan required the cooperation of multiple governmental bodies whose jurisdictions overlapped in confusing and sometimes contradictory ways, creating a bureaucratic landscape almost as treacherous as the physical terrain through which his sewers would need to navigate. The Metropolitan Board of Works possessed authority over some aspects of the project, but not others, while local parishes retained control over certain elements of infrastructure that would need to be integrated into the larger system, creating opportunities for political interference that could derail the entire undertaking. The financial requirements of the project exceeded the normal boundaries of public expenditure by such a margin that entirely new mechanisms for funding public works had to be developed, involving the creation of long-term debt obligations that would commit future generations of London residents to paying for infrastructure they would inherit rather than choose. The concept of borrowing money for projects that would not generate immediate revenue challenged the prevailing assumptions about fiscal responsibility, requiring Bazalgette to become not just an engineer, but an advocate for a new understanding of public investment that prioritized long-term benefits over short-term costs. The resistance that Bazalgette encountered from property owners whose land would be affected by the construction process reflected broader tensions between individual rights and collective needs that were becoming increasingly prominent in an era of rapid urban growth as the scale of infrastructure required to support large populations necessarily infringed upon traditional concepts of private property in ways that previous generations had not been forced to contemplate. The power of eminent domain, while legally established, had rarely been exercised on the scale that Bazalgette's project would require, creating legal and political precedents that would influence urban development for decades to come. The workforce that would be required to excavate and construct Bazalgette's sewer system represented a mobilization of human labor comparable to major military campaigns, involving thousands of workers whose safety and coordination would present challenges that went far beyond the normal scope of engineering projects. The dangerous nature of working in confined spaces filled with toxic gases required the development of new safety protocols and protective equipment, while the sheer number of excavation sites operating simultaneously throughout the city created logistical problems that tested the limits of contemporary organizational capabilities. Bazalgette's approach to managing this vast undertaking revealed a systematic mind that understood the interconnected nature of technical, political, and social challenges, as his project required not just the construction of physical infrastructure, but the creation of institutional structures capable of maintaining and operating that include the structure over the extended time periods necessary to justify the initial investment. The establishment of permanent bureaucratic organizations to oversee the system's operation represented an innovation in urban governance that would serve as a model for cities throughout the world as they grappled with similar challenges. Time frame within which Bazalgette was expected to complete his transformative project reflected the urgent nature of London's crisis. Its public pressure for immediate relief from the intolerable conditions created by the existing system competed with the technical reality that comprehensive solutions required years of careful planning and methodical construction. The political pressure to demonstrate visible progress while maintaining the quality standards necessary for long-term success created a balancing act that required constant communication with public officials, newspaper editors, and community leaders who demanded regular updates on the project's advancement. The international attention that began to focus on Bazalgette's work as news of London's ambitious undertaking spread throughout Europe and beyond reflected growing recognition that the challenges facing London were not unique, as cities throughout the industrialized world struggled with similar problems created by rapid population growth outpacing infrastructure development. Engineers and urban planners from other countries began to study Bazalgette's methods and innovations, creating an informal network of professional communication that would accelerate the spread of systematic approaches to urban sanitation throughout the developed world. The testing and refinement of Bazalgette's designs required the construction of experimental sections that could be evaluated before committing to the full-scale implementation of untested technologies, a process that added complexity and delay to a project that was already challenging the limits of contemporary engineering knowledge. The feedback from these pilot projects led to modifications and improvements that strengthened the final design, but also highlighted the iterative nature of innovation in fields where theoretical knowledge had to be supplemented by practical experience gained through trial and error. The integration of Bazalgette's new sewer system with London's existing infrastructure required careful coordination with other urban systems, including water supply, gas distribution, and transportation. networks that shared the underground space through which his tunnels would need to pass. The three-dimensional puzzle of routing multiple utility systems through limited underground space while maintaining access for maintenance and repair represented a planning challenge that required new approaches to urban design and engineering. Coordination. The quality control measures that Bazalgette implemented to ensure the long-term reliability of his system reflected his understanding that any failure in such a massive undertaking would not only threaten public health, but would also undermine confidence in systematic approaches to urban infrastructure, potentially setting back similar projects in other cities by decades. The inspection protocols and testing procedures that he developed became standard practices in large-scale construction projects, establishing professional standards that continue to influence engineering practice today. The environmental considerations that informed Bazalgette's design reflected an emerging awareness of the interconnected nature of urban and natural systems, as his plan required careful attention to the impact of London's waste disposal on downstream communities and ecosystems that had previously been ignored in discussions of urban development. The concept of treating the city as part of a larger environmental system rather than as an isolated entity represented a significant shift in thinking about the relationship between human settlement and natural processes. The legacy of Bazalgette's achievement extends far beyond the immediate solution to London's sanitation crisis, as his systematic approach to urban infrastructure planning established principles and practices that would guide city development throughout the industrial world, demonstrating that engineering solutions to social problems required not just technical expertise, but also political skill, financial innovation, educational capability on a scale that had rarely been attempted in human history. The commencement of actual construction on Bazalgette's grand design marked the beginning of what would become the largest urban transformation project ever undertaken in human history. Up to that point, a massive mobilization of human labor, industrial resources, and engineering innovation that would literally reshape the underground geography of London, while simultaneously creating new models for managing complex public works projects that would influence urban development throughout the world. The scale of the undertaking defied easy comprehension, involving the excavation of enough earth to fill a small mountain, the manufacture of bricks in quantities that strained the productive capacity of entire regions, and the coordination of work crews whose combined efforts would create an underground city more extensive than many surface communities. The first phase of construction required the establishment of work sites throughout London that would operate simultaneously, creating a complex logistical challenge that demanded new approaches to urban coordination as streets that had already been congested with normal commercial traffic now had to accommodate the movement of vast quantities of construction materials. Excavated soil was cooked in the thousands of workers whose daily journeys to and from job sites added another layer of complexity to the city's transportation systems. The site of London during the early stages of construction resembled a city under siege, with temporary structures and equipment installations occupying every available space, while the sounds of excavation and construction created a constant urban symphony that spoke to the magnitude of the transformation underway. The excavation work itself presented challenges that pushed the boundaries of contemporary understanding of soil mechanics and underground construction, as London's geological foundation consisted of layers of clay, sand, and other materials that had been deposited over thousands of years, creating conditions that varied dramatically from one location to another and required constant adaptation of construction techniques to accommodate local conditions. The workers who descended into these excavations faced dangers that ranged from cavings, to exposure to toxic gases that accumulated in confined spaces, necessitating the development of safety protocols and rescue procedures that had never been tested on such a scale. The brick manufacturing required for Bazalgette's system consumed the output of dozens of kilns, operating at full capacity for years. Each brick manufactured to specifications that ensured resistance to the chemical corrosion that would result from prolonged contact with sewage, while also meeting structural requirements that would allow the tunnels to withstand the weight of London's streets and buildings above them. The quality control process for these millions of bricks required the development of testing procedures that could identify defective materials before they were incorporated into structures where failure would be catastrophic, creating new standards for construction materials that would influence building practices far beyond the immediate requirements of the sewer project. The workforce assembled for this massive taking represented a cross-section of London's laboring population, from skilled craftsmen whose expertise in stonework and masonry was essential for the most technically demanding aspects of construction, to unskilled laborers whose physical strength and endurance would be tested by work conditions that challenged human capability. The coordination of these diverse work crews required supervisors who could manage not just the technical aspects of construction, but also the human dynamics of men working under extreme stress and dangerous conditions, often for wages that barely exceeded subsistence levels, despite the skilled nature of much of the work. The innovation in construction techniques that emerged from the practical challenges of building Valjet's system influenced engineering practices far beyond the immediate requirements of the project, as contractors and engineers developed new methods for tunneling, new approaches to waterproofing, and new solutions for the structural challenges involved in creating large, underground spaces that could resist both the pressure of overlying earth and the corrosive effects of flowing sewage. These technical innovations, born from necessity, would find applications in mining, transportation, and other underground construction projects throughout the industrial world. The pumping stations that the Valjet system required represented marvels of Victorian engineering in their own right, housing steam engines of unprecedented size and sophistication that could lift millions of gallons of sewage to heights necessary to maintain flow through the system's complex network of tunnels and channels. The construction of these facilities required the integration of civil and mechanical engineering on a scale that had rarely been attempted, as the buildings had to house massive machinery while also serving as architectural monuments that would demonstrate the civic pride and technical capability of Victorian London. The disruption caused by years of simultaneous construction projects throughout the city tested the patience and adaptability of London's residents in ways that went far beyond the inconvenience of temporarily blocked streets or noisy work sites, as the systematic reconstruction of the city's underground infrastructure required the temporary disconnection of existing drainage systems, creating periods when neighborhoods had to cope with even worse sanitary conditions than those that had prompted the project in the first place. The political pressure created by these temporary hardships threatened to derail the entire undertaking at several points, requiring Valjet and his supporters to maintain public confidence in the long-term benefits of a project whose immediate effects often seemed to worsen rather than improve living conditions. The financial management of a project of such unprecedented scale required innovations in public financing that stretched the existing mechanisms for government borrowing beyond their normal limits, as the Metropolitan Board of Works had to secure funding for expenditures that exceeded the annual budgets of many national governments, while simultaneously managing cash flow for ongoing construction that could not be delayed without risking the collapse of partially completed structures. The complexity of these financial arrangements required new forms of accounting and project management that would later influence how governments approached large-scale public works projects. The coordination with existing urban infrastructure presented challenges that multiplied the complexity of every aspect of construction, as Valjet's sewers had to be integrated with water supply systems, gas distribution networks, and transportation infrastructure without interrupting the essential services that London's population depended upon for survival. The three-dimensional mapping required to route new tunnels through underground space already occupied by other utilities demanded surveying techniques and record-keeping systems that pushed the boundaries of contemporary technology while establishing precedents for urban planning that would influence city development for generations. The quality of construction achieved despite the pressure for rapid completion reflected Lozange's insistence on maintaining standards that would ensure the long-term reliability of the system, even when political pressure demanded visible progress that might have been achieved more quickly through less thorough construction methods. The inspection procedures that were established to verify the integrity of every section of tunnel and every connection point created new professional standards for construction oversight that would influence engineering practice throughout the industrial world. The seasonal challenges of construction work that continued year-round required adaptations to cope with London's climate that tested the ingenuity of contractors and workers alike. Excavation work in winter conditions created problems with frozen ground and flooding that had to be solved without the benefit of modern heating or pumping equipment. The logistics of maintaining work progress during periods of severe weather required contingency planning and resource management that demonstrated the organizational sophistication necessary for managing projects of unprecedented complexity. The impact on London's working-class communities extended far beyond the employment opportunities created by the massive construction project. The disruption of normal urban routines forced adaptations in daily life that revealed both the resilience and the vulnerability of populations already living on the margins of survival. The temporary displacement of residents from areas where construction required the demolition of existing buildings created housing shortages that exacerbated the overcrowding problems that the improved sanitation was intended to address, highlighting the interconnected nature of urban problems that could not be solved through infrastructure improvements alone. The technological innovations developed specifically for the Bazarjet's project influenced engineering practices in fields far removed from sewage management, as the solutions devised for moving large quantities of liquid through underground tunnels found applications in mining drainage, industrial process control, and water supply systems that benefited from the accumulated experience of London's massive undertaking. The testing of materials under extreme conditions provided data that informed engineering decisions in projects throughout the empire and beyond. As London's experience became a laboratory for understanding the behavior of construction materials under stresses that had never been systematically studied, the international attention focused on London's ambitious project attracted engineers, urban planners, government officials from throughout Europe and beyond who came to study Bazarjet's methods and innovations, creating informal networks of professional communication that accelerated the spread of systematic approaches to urban infrastructure throughout the industrialized world. The documentation of construction techniques and project management methods created a body of technical literature that would guide similar projects for decades, establishing London's sewer system not just as a solution to local problems, but as a model for urban development. Worldwide, the gradual completion of different sections of the system allowed for testing and refinement of operational procedures before the entire network came online, providing opportunities to identify and correct problems that might have been catastrophic if discovered only after the system was fully operational. This phased approach to implementation, while adding complexity to the construction process, demonstrated the value of systematic testing in large-scale engineering projects and established precedents for project management that would influence complex undertakings in other fields. The transformation of London's atmosphere as sections of the new system began operation provided the first tangible evidence that Bazarjet's ambitious plan was achieving its intended goals. As neighborhoods where new sewers had been connected to the system experienced dramatic improvements in air quality that served as powerful demonstrations of the project's value to skeptics who would question the enormous expenditure of public resources. The contrast between areas served by the new system and those still dependent on older infrastructure created a powerful incentive for rapid completion of the remaining work, as residents could observe directly the benefits of systematic sanitation management. The celebration that accompanied the formal opening of completed sections of the system reflected not just relief at the solution to immediate problems, but genuine pride in the achievement of a project that demonstrated the capability of organized human effort to address challenges that had seemed insurmountable, creating a sense of civic accomplishment that would influence London's approach to urban problems for generations. The transformation from a city drowning in its own waste to a model of sanitary engineering represented a triumph of systematic thinking and sustained effort that would inspire similar undertakings throughout the world, establishing new standards for what urban civilization could achieve when technical expertise was combined with political will and adequate resources. In the deep tunnels beneath Victorian London, where Bazalgette's great sewers carved their way through layers of history accumulated over to millennia of human habitation, an unexpected archaeology began to emerge, revealing the material traces of countless generations who had lived, worked, and died in the city above. The excavation work required for the sewer system created opportunities for discovery that would never again be available on such a scale as a systematic exploration of London's underground revealed artifacts and structures that told stories of urban development, stretching back to Roman times, each layer of soil and debris serving as a page in the vast book of human experience written in the earth. Beneath the modern city, the workers who descended into these excavations found themselves inadvertently serving as archaeological explorers, their shovels and picks uncovering fragments of pottery, coins, jewelry, and personal items that had been lost or discarded centuries earlier. Each discovery providing a glimpse into the daily lives of people whose individual stories had been forgotten by history, but whose material possessions continued to speak across the centuries about the universal human experiences of hope, loss, love, and struggle. These chance discoveries, initially regarded as curiosities that briefly interrupted the serious business of construction, gradually accumulated into a collection that provided unprecedented insights into the material culture of London's past. The Roman foundations that emerged from beneath centuries of accumulated debris revealed the sophisticated engineering that had characterized the city's earliest incarnation as Londinium, demonstrating that London's struggle with urban infrastructure was not a uniquely Victorian challenge, but rather the latest chapter in a story that had been unfolding for nearly 2,000 years. The discovery of Roman drainage systems, still partially functional after centuries of abandonment, provided Bazalgette's engineers with unexpected insights into ancient solutions to problems that their own generation was attempting to solve with the most advanced technology of the industrial age. The medieval artifacts that appeared as excavation proceeded through the archaeological layers deposited during London's gradual expansion from Roman settlement to medieval commercial center, told stories of craftsmen and merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims. Lives had contributed to the city's development during the centuries when it was establishing itself as a center of trade and political power. The fragments of medieval pottery, tools, and decorative objects that emerged from the soil provided evidence of daily life in an era when the city's population numbered in the thousands rather than millions, when the Thames was a clean river that served as a highway for commerce rather than a repository for urban waste. The Tudorara discoveries that appeared in the upper layers of archaeological deposit reflected London's transformation during the Renaissance into a city of international significance, with artifacts that spoke to the growing sophistication of urban life and the increasing complexity of the economic relationships that connected London to the broader world. The coins, jewelry, and household items from this period revealed a society in transition, adapting to new forms of commerce and new relationships with distant places, while continuing to grapple with the fundamental challenges of organizing large numbers of people in limited space. The geological context of these archaeological discoveries provided insights into the natural history of the London basin that helped explain the challenges that all generations of the city's inhabitants had faced in dealing with water management and waste disposal. it's the clay soils that had preserved so many artifacts for centuries also created the drainage problems that had plagued every attempt to create effective sanitation systems. The interaction between human settlement and natural geography became visible in the excavated sections, revealing how each generation had adapted to the same fundamental environmental constraints while developing increasingly sophisticated technological solutions. The preservation conditions in London's underground environment had created a unique archaeological laboratory where organic materials that would have decomposed in other soil conditions remained intact for examination by Victorian researchers, providing unprecedented opportunities to study textiles, leather goods, wooden implements, and other perishable artifacts that rarely survived in other archaeological contexts. The leather shoes, woolen clothing fragments, and wooden tools that emerged from the sewer excavations told intimate stories of individual lives lived centuries earlier, revealing details about fashion, craftsmanship, and daily routine that written records rarely preserved. The industrial archaeology that the sewer construction inadvertently documented included the remains of earlier attempts at urban infrastructure that had been buried and forgotten as the city evolved, revealing a palimpsest of engineering solutions that showed how each generation had built upon the achievements and failures of their predecessors. The discovery of abandoned water pipes, drainage channels, and foundation walls provided a physical history of London's development that complemented but often contradicted the official records maintained by government and commercial institutions. The human remains that occasionally appeared during excavation work created sobering reminders of the mortality that had always characterized urban life, particularly for the poor, whose deaths often went unrecorded and whose burials sometimes occurred in unofficial locations that were later forgotten as the city expanded around them. These discoveries, handled with the respect due to the dead, while providing valuable information about health, nutrition, and living conditions in earlier eras, revealed the harsh realities of urban existence for those who had not survived long enough to leave written records of their experiences. The religious artifacts that emerged from the excavations reflected the spiritual life of London's inhabitants across the centuries, from Roman votive objects to medieval pilgrimage badges to Protestant devotional items, each representing the ways that different generations had sought comfort and meaning. In the face of urban challenges that remained remarkably consistent across the centuries, the discovery of these religious objects in contexts that suggested they had been treasured possessions rather than mere ornaments provided insights into the psychological resources that earlier generations had drawn upon to cope with lives that were often harsh and uncertain. The evidence of earlier sanitation attempts that appeared throughout the excavations revealed a long history of struggle with the same problems that Bazalgette's system was designed to solve, showing how previous generations had improvised solutions that reflected both the ingenuity and the limitations of their technological capabilities. The wooden pipes, stone-lined channels, crude drainage systems discovered during construction provided a technological genealogy that showed how each era's solutions had contributed to the accumulated knowledge that made Bazalgette's comprehensive approach possible. The commercial artifacts discovered in the excavations told stories of London's role as a center of trade and manufacturing, with imported goods that revealed the city's connections to distant markets and locally produced items that showed the development of specialized crafts and industries. The fragments of imported pottery, glass, and metalwork found alongside locally made tools and household items provided evidence of the complex economic relationships that had sustained London's growth across the centuries, while demonstrating how global trade had influenced even the most intimate aspects of daily life. The technological artifacts that emerged from different historical layers provided a material record of innovation and adaptation that paralleled the written history of London's development, showing how each generation had developed new tools and techniques for addressing the challenges of urban life while building upon the accumulated knowledge of their predecessors. The evolution of construction techniques, manufacturing methods, and engineering solutions became visible in the physical remains discovered during excavation, providing insights into the gradual development of the technological capabilities that made Baselge's ambitious project possible. The environmental evidence preserved in the soil, layers excavated for the sewer construction provided information about changes in London's natural environment that had occurred as human settlement transformed the landscape from rural agricultural area to dense urban center. The seeds, pollen, and other organic remains that were discovered in different geological layers told stories of changing vegetation, climate variations, and the gradual replacement of natural ecosystems with urban infrastructure that created the environmental challenges that successive generations had been forced to address. The documentation of these archaeological discoveries, initially haphazard, but gradually becoming more systematic as their significance became apparent, created a record of London's material history that would influence both historical scholarship and archaeological methodology for generations. The recognition that major construction projects provided unprecedented opportunities for archaeological investigation established precedents for the systematic study of urban development that would guide similar projects throughout the world, demonstrating how engineering work could contribute to historical understanding while achieving its primary practical goals. The integration of archaeological findings into the broader understanding of London's development revealed connections between past and present that helped explain why certain urban problems had persisted across centuries, while also demonstrating how technological innovation had gradually expanded the range of solutions available to each successive generation. The physical evidence of earlier attempts to address sanitation, transportation, and housing challenges provided context for understanding why Baselge's comprehensive approach represented such a significant advance over previous efforts, while also revealing the continuities that connected Victorian engineering to the accumulated wisdom of centuries of urban experience. The preservation and study of artifacts discovered during sewer construction created new models for the relationship between practical engineering work and historical scholarship, demonstrating how major infrastructure projects could contribute to cultural understanding while achieving their immediate utilitarian goals. The systematic collection and analysis of archaeological materials discovered during construction established precedents for the integration of historical preservation with urban development that would influence how cities throughout the world approached major construction projects that affected historically significant areas beneath the streets of Victorian London in the labyrinthine network of tunnels, sewers, and forgotten spaces that honeycombed the earth below the city's foundations. An entire ecosystem had evolved that bore little resemblance to any environment found in the natural world. It sustained its own complex web of life forms that had adapted to conditions that would challenge the imagination of surface dwellers. This subterranean realm, hidden from the consciousness of most Londoners, yet intimately connected to their daily existence, operated according to its own biological and social laws, creating a parallel universe where survival depended on different skills and different forms of knowledge than those required in the world above ground. The rat populations that thrived in this underground environment had evolved beyond their countryside cousins into creatures specifically adapted to urban existence. Their intelligence sharpened by the constant challenges of navigating human-made environments while avoiding the various forms of extermination that surface dwellers periodically attempted to implement. These urban rats had developed social structures of remarkable complexity, with territorial boundaries that reflected the geography of sewer systems and food sources, communication systems that could convey information about danger and opportunity across considerable distances, and behavioral patterns that demonstrated their sophisticated understanding of human routines and vulnerabilities. The size that these underground rats achieved in the nutrient-rich environment of London's sewers challenged the assumptions of surface dwellers about the natural limits of rodent growth, as specimens discovered during sewer maintenance work sometimes reach dimensions that approach those of small cats, their bulk sustained by the abundance of organic matter that flowed through the city's waste systems. These creatures had learned to exploit every aspect of their environment, from the warmest spots near steam pipes to the most productive feeding areas where kitchen waste accumulated, creating a parallel economy based on the discarded abundance of human consumption. The bacterial and fungal ecosystems that flourished in the perpetual dampness of London's underground created their own microenvironments that processed organic waste according to biological laws that operated independently of human intention or control, transforming the byproducts of urban life into substances that sometimes proved useful, and sometimes created new problems that required human intervention. The complex chemistry of decomposition in these controlled environments produced gases, minerals, and organic compounds that accumulated in patterns that reflected both the waste disposal habits of surface dwellers and the peculiar conditions created by human engineering. The human inhabitants of this underground realm formed their own distinct social class, bound together by their intimate knowledge of spaces that remained invisible to most Londoners, and by their willingness to perform labor that others found too dangerous or too disgusting to contemplate. These sewer workers, tunnel diggers, and maintenance crews developed their own culture and their own codes of conduct that governed behavior in environments where traditional social rules proved inadequate to address the unique challenges of underground work. The informal economy that operated in London's underground spaces reflected the resourcefulness of individuals who had learned to extract value from materials and opportunities that surface dwellers discarded or overlooked, creating networks of exchange that connected the waste streams of the wealthy to the survival needs of the poor through complex chains of collection, processing, and redistribution. The mudlarks who scavenged in the Thames during low tide, the bone collectors who gathered organic waste for processing into various commercial products, and the rag gatherers who sorted through domestic refuse represented different specializations within an economic system that operated parallel to, but largely separate from, the official commerce of the surface city. The territorial codes that governed access to the most productive scavenging areas reflected the development of property rights that operated without legal recognition or official enforcement, yet commanded respect from those who understood the complex social ecology of survival among London's poor. These informal territories were passed down through family lines or sold between individuals according to agreements that had no standing in law, but possessed binding force within the communities that recognized their validity, creating a shadow economy of space and opportunity that operated according to its own logic of fairness and mutual benefit. The communication systems that connected different parts of London's underground community enabled the rapid spread of information about opportunities and dangers that could affect the welfare of individuals, whose survival depended on their ability to respond quickly to changing conditions. These informal networks carried news about which areas were currently being patrolled by police, which wealthy households were disposing of particularly valuable refuse, which construction projects might provide temporary employment opportunities, and which areas should be avoided due to health hazards or territorial disputes. The specialized knowledge required for successful navigation of London's underground environment encompassed skills that had no equivalent in surface occupations, from the ability to read the subtle signs that indicated structural instability in tunnel walls to the expertise required to identify valuable materials. Among the vast quantities of waste that flowed through the city's disposal systems, this knowledge was passed down through apprenticeship relationships that created mentor-student bonds within underground communities, ensuring that essential survival skills were preserved and transmitted even as the specific conditions of underground life evolved with changes in surface technology and waste disposal practices. The health challenges faced by those who worked or lived in London's underground environments required adaptations that tested the limits of human resilience. Exposure to toxic gases, infectious diseases, and various forms of contamination created medical problems that were poorly understood by surface physicians and inadequately addressed by existing public health measures. The underground workers developed their own folk medicine and their own strategies for managing health risks that reflected their intimate knowledge of the specific hazards associated with different types of underground work. Though these informal medical practices could do little to address the long-term health consequences of prolonged exposure to dangerous environments, the seasonal variations that affected London's underground ecosystem created rhythms of opportunity and danger that influenced the strategies and movements of both human and animal inhabitants. As changes in surface weather patterns affected the flow of water through sewer systems, the accumulation of waste in various locations, and the behavior of the rat populations that competed with human scavengers for access to valuable resources. The winter months brought different challenges than summer periods, requiring different survival strategies and different forms of cooperation among underground communities. The relationship between London's underground inhabitants and the surface authorities, who occasionally attempted to regulate or eliminate their activities, reflected broader tensions between official and unofficial approaches to urban problems, as government officials struggled to control activities that they poorly understood, while underground communities developed strategies for avoiding official attention while continuing to provide services that surface society found distasteful but necessary. The periodic raids and cleanup campaigns launched by surface authorities often failed to achieve their stated goals because they were based on incomplete understanding of the complex social and economic relationships that sustained underground communities, the religious and cultural practices that developed among London's underground communities reflected adaptations of surface traditions to the unique conditions of subterranean life, creating forms of spiritual expression that addressed the particular psychological challenges faced by individuals whose daily existence brought them into intimate contact with the waste and decay that surface dwellers preferred to ignore. These underground spiritual traditions often emphasized themes of transformation and redemption that spoke to the possibility of finding meaning and dignity even in the most challenging circumstances. The criminal activities that found refuge in London's underground spaces reflected both the opportunities for concealment that the tunnel systems provided and the desperation of individuals who had been excluded from legitimate means of survival in surface society. The networks of tunnels and sewers that connected different parts of the city provided escape routes and hiding places that challenged the ability of surface law enforcement to pursue criminals effectively. While the complex geography of underground spaces created opportunities for activities that would have been impossible to conduct on the surface without protection, the technological innovations that emerged from the practical challenges of underground survival demonstrated the ingenuity of individuals who had learned to improvise solutions to problems that were not grasped by official technology or commercial products. The tools, techniques, equipment developed by underground workers and inhabitants often proved superior to official solutions for specific underground applications, though the knowledge embodied in these innovations rarely found its way into official engineering practice due to the social barriers that separated underground communities from surface institutions. The documentation of underground life that emerged through the observations of social reformers, journalists, and government inspectors who ventured into London's subterranean spaces provided surface dwellers with glimpses of a world that operated according to different rules and different values, challenging comfortable assumptions about the nature of urban civilization and the relationship between progress and human welfare. These accounts, while often filtered through the biases and limitations of surface observers, created a literary genre that influenced public understanding of urban poverty and contributed to reform movements that sought to address the conditions that forced individuals to seek survival in underground environments. the legacy of London's underground ecosystem extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of Victorian urban development, as the social and economic relationships that evolved in response to the challenges of subterranean survival provided models for understanding how human communities adapt to extreme environments while maintaining forms of cooperation and mutual support that enable survival under conditions that would defeat individual efforts. The study of these underground communities contributed to broader understanding of human social organization and the relationship between environment and culture that would influence anthropological and sociological research for generations. In the carefully maintained ledgers and incident reports of the Metropolitan Police, archived in buildings that would outlast many of the lives they documented, lies a secret history of Victorian London that reveals the city's nocturnal character through the eyes of those whose duty required them to patrol its darkest corners and witness its most desperate moments. These official records, written in the measured prose of bureaucratic necessity, contain within their formal language a wealth of information about the hidden life of the city, the unspoken codes that govern behavior among London's poor, and the complex social relationships that flourished in the spaces between official regulation and human need. The constables who walked their beats through London's poorest neighborhoods developed an intimate knowledge of the rhythms and patterns of street life that enabled them to read the subtle signs of trouble brewing or opportunity emerging. Their daily observations, recorded in reports that accumulated over time into a detailed ethnography of urban survival. These officers learned to recognize the difference between legitimate poverty and criminal activity, to understand the unspoken rules that governed territorial disputes among different groups of street dwellers, and to identify the early warning signs of the various crises that periodically erupted in communities where desperation was a constant companion. The language that appeared in these police reports reflected the development of a specialized vocabulary that could describe situations and relationships that had no equivalent in middle-class experience, as officers struggled to convey to their superiors the complex realities of lives lived on the margins of society. The formal prose of official documentation strained to accommodate descriptions of living arrangements that defied conventional understanding of family and household, economic activities that operated outside recognized categories of legitimate commerce, and social relationships that combined elements of cooperation and conflict in ways that challenged standard assumptions about human behavior. The recurring names that appeared in police reports over months and years told stories of individuals whose lives intersected repeatedly with law enforcement, not necessarily because they were habitual criminals, but because their circumstances forced them to navigate the narrow space between survival and illegality in ways that brought them to official attention. These repeat appearances in police records revealed the cyclical nature of poverty and desperation, as individuals struggled with problems that could not be solved through temporary interventions or short-term assistance, requiring instead long-term changes in circumstances that were beyond the power of individual effort to achieve. The territorial knowledge embedded in police reports reflected the officers' understanding of London's geography as it was actually lived by its poorest residents, rather than as it appeared on official maps or in the imagination of city planners. These reports documented the informal boundaries that divided different neighborhoods and communities, the routes that connected areas of opportunity with areas of refuge, and the locations where different types of illegal or semi-legal activities were tolerated or actively suppressed depending on local conditions and community relationships. The seasonal patterns that emerged from systematic analysis of police records revealed how the rhythms of urban poverty were influenced by factors ranging from weather conditions to holiday celebrations to the agricultural cycles that still affected food prices and employment opportunities in an era when London remained more closely connected to rural production than would be the case in later generations. These seasonal variations created predictable changes in crime patterns, health crises, and social tension that experienced officers learned to anticipate and prepare for through adjustments in patrol routes and enforcement priorities. The documentation of domestic violence that appeared in police reports provided glimpses into the private lives of families whose struggles with poverty were compounded by the additional stresses created by overcrowded living conditions, unemployment, and the various forms of social disruption that characterized life in London's poorest neighborhoods. These reports, while limited by the reluctance of victims to report incidents and the limited options available to officers for addressing family disputes, revealed patterns of abuse and neglect that reflected the broader social problems created by economic inequality and inadequate social support systems. The records of public health incidents that required police intervention documented the intersection between law enforcement and medical emergency in communities where illness and injury often went untreated until they reached crisis proportions, creating situations that required immediate action to prevent the spread of disease or to address medical emergencies that threatened public safety. These reports revealed the gaps in official public health systems and the ways that police officers often found themselves serving as first responders to medical crises for which they had little training or adequate resources. The documentation of child welfare cases that appeared in police records told heartbreaking stories of young lives shaped by circumstances beyond their control, as officers encountered children who had been abandoned, abused, or forced into premature adulthood by family circumstances that made normal childhood development impossible. These cases revealed the limitations of existing child protection systems and the ways that poverty created conditions that endangered children even when parents were making desperate efforts to provide for their basic needs. The informal codes of conduct that governed relationships among London's street populations were recorded in police reports through descriptions of conflicts and alliances that reflected complex social hierarchies based on factors ranging from length of residence in particular neighborhoods to reputation for reliability in various forms of mutual assistance. These codes operated parallel to, but largely separate from, official law, creating alternative systems of justice and social control that addressed problems that formal legal systems were ill-equipped to handle. The economic activities documented in police reports revealed the existence of a vast informal economy that operated alongside but separate from official commerce, involving everything from small-scale trading in recovered materials to complex networks of mutual financial assistance that enabled individuals to survive periods of unemployment or illness. These economic relationships often involved activities that were technically illegal but were tolerated by both communities and law enforcement because they provided essential services that were not available through official channels. The religious and cultural practices that appeared in police reports, usually in the context of disputes or celebrations that attracted official attention, revealed the diversity of beliefs and traditions that flourished among London's immigrant and working-class communities, creating a complex cultural landscape that challenged official assumptions about British identity and social unity. These practices often served important functions in maintaining community cohesion and providing psychological support for individuals facing the stresses of urban poverty, though they were sometimes misunderstood or misrepresented by officers whose own cultural backgrounds differed significantly from those of the communities they police. The documentation of political activities that appeared in police reports reflected the growing awareness among London's poor that their individual struggles were connected to broader social and economic problems that require collective action to address effectively. These reports documented everything from informal discussions about labor conditions to organized protests and demonstrations, revealing the development of political consciousness among communities that were often portrayed by official sources as passive victims of circumstances beyond their control. The mental health crises that were documented in police reports revealed the psychological toll of urban poverty and the limited resources available for addressing mental illness among populations. that could not afford private medical care and were often excluded from the few public institutions that existed for treating psychological disorders. These cases demonstrated the ways that untreated mental illness could contribute to cycles of poverty and criminality, while highlighting the need for more comprehensive approaches to public health that addressed psychological as well as physical needs. The networks of information that connected different parts of London's poor communities were revealed in police reports through descriptions of how news about opportunities, dangers, and official actions spread through unofficial channels that could reach individuals who were otherwise isolated from formal communication systems. These informal information networks served essential functions in enabling communities to respond quickly to changing conditions, while also creating opportunities for the spread of rumors and misinformation that could contribute to social tension and conflict. The relationship between police officers and the communities they patrolled evolved over time in ways that were documented through changes in the tone and content of incident reports, as officers who spent years walking the same beats developed personal relationships with residents that influenced their approach to law enforcement and their understanding of the complex social problems that contributed to crime and disorder. These relationships sometimes created conflicts between official duty and personal sympathy that challenged officers to balance their legal obligations with their human understanding of the circumstances that drove individuals to desperate actions. The technological changes that affected police work during the Victorian era were reflected in reports that documented the gradual introduction of new communication systems, transportation methods, and investigative techniques that changed the nature of law enforcement, while also creating new opportunities for both crime prevention and criminal activity. The adaptation of police methods to keep pace with urban growth and technological change revealed the dynamic nature of the relationship between official authority and unofficial resistance in rapidly changing urban environments. The international dimensions of London's criminal activity that appeared in police reports reflected the city's role as a center of global commerce and immigration, creating opportunities for criminal networks that operated across national boundaries, while also bringing together individuals from different cultural backgrounds who had to negotiate differences in language, custom, and legal tradition, while pursuing both legitimate and illegitimate activities in a cosmopolitan urban environment. In the elegant drawing rooms of London's most fashionable neighborhoods, where crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across polished mahogany tables set with bone china so delicate it seemed to capture and hold the afternoon sunlight like frozen dewdrops, an entirely different world existed that operated according to rules as rigid and unforgiving as those that governed the factories and slums. Though the consequences of transgression took the form of social exile rather than physical starvation, these spaces, perfumed with the scent of imported tea and fresh flowers arranged according to the latest continental fashions, served as stages for the performance of a complex social drama where every gesture, every word, every pause in conversation carried meaning that could elevate or destroy reputations, built over generations of careful cultivation. The ritual of afternoon tea, elevated to an art form that required years of training to master properly, represented far more than simple refreshment, serving instead as a carefully choreographed demonstration of cultural refinement that distinguished those who belonged to London's elite society from those who merely possessed wealth without the accompanying knowledge of how to display it appropriately. The precise timing of invitations, the careful selection of guests whose social positions complemented each other without creating awkward hierarchical conflicts, and the orchestration of conversation that touched upon approved topics while avoiding subjects that might introduce discord or controversy, all required a level of social intelligence that had to be cultivated from early childhood through constant practice and observation. The China service itself told stories of family, history, and social connections that extended across continents and generations. As the most prestigious families displayed porcelain that had been acquired through carefully maintained relationships with specific manufacturers whose products served as markers of sophisticated tastes and economic resources. The patterns, colors, and decorative elements of tea services were chosen not merely for their aesthetic appeal, but for their ability to communicate messages about the hostess's knowledge of current fashion, her family's historical connections to particular regions or trading relationships, and her understanding of the subtle distinctions that separated authentic luxury from mere ostentation. The language of invitation and acceptance that governed participation in these social rituals required mastery of nuances that could make the difference between social advancement and social disaster, as the wrong phrase in a written invitation or an inappropriate response to a social overture could create misunderstandings that would reverberate through London's interconnected elite circles for months or even years. The timing of responses to invitations, the selection of appropriate stationery, and the careful calibration of enthusiasm and reserve in written communication all required knowledge that was transmitted through informal networks of family and social connection rather than through any systematic educational process. The conversation that took place during these afternoon gatherings followed unwritten rules that were as complex and demanding as any legal code, requiring participants to demonstrate their familiarity with current literary works, musical performances, and artistic exhibitions while avoiding any display of knowledge that might be considered too scholarly or insufficiently feminine for the social context. The art of maintaining conversational flow that engaged all participants without allowing any individual to dominate discussion or introduce topics that might create discomfort required social skills that few people possessed naturally, and that took years of practice to develop to the level expected in the most exclusive circles. The fashion displayed during these social occasions served multiple functions that extended far beyond personal adornment, as clothing choices communicated information about family financial resources, awareness of current European trends, an understanding of the subtle distinctions that separated appropriate luxury from vulgar display. The fabrics, colors, styles chosen for afternoon social events had to strike a careful balance between demonstrating prosperity and maintaining the understated elegance that marked authentic aristocratic taste, while also incorporating enough contemporary elements to show awareness of current fashion without appearing to follow trends too obviously or enthusiastically. The games and entertainments that might be offered during extended social visits required careful consideration of the intellectual and physical capabilities of guests. These activities had to be challenging enough to provide interest without being so demanding as to cause embarrassment or reveal unflattering disparities in education or ability among participants. The selection of appropriate books for discussion, puzzles for group solving, or gentle physical activities for outdoor gatherings all required understanding of the delicate balance between entertainment and social harmony that characterized successful elite social events. The networking and alliance building that took place during these seemingly frivolous social gatherings served essential functions in maintaining the economic and political relationships that sustained London's elite families, as business partnerships, marriage negotiations, and political coalitions were often initiated, through casual conversations that took place in drawing rooms rather than in official business settings. The informal intelligence gathering that occurred during these social events provided families with information about market conditions, political developments, and social opportunities that could be crucial to maintaining their competitive position. In London's complex elite hierarchy, the charitable activities that were often discussed and organized during these social gatherings represented an important component of elite women's social responsibility, though the selection of appropriate causes and the methods of providing assistance required careful consideration of how charitable involvement would affect family reputation and social standing. The balance between genuine concern for social problems and the social advantages that could be gained through visible, charitable activity created complex, ethical, and practical considerations that influenced how elite families approached their obligations to the broader community. The seasonal migrations that took elite families away from London for extended periods required careful coordination with other families to ensure that social networks remained intact despite physical separation, as the timing of departures and returns had to be synchronized to maintain the continuity of social relationships that sustained elite society. The coordination of house parties, travel schedules, and social calendars across multiple families in multiple locations required organizational skills that were essential to maintaining social position, but that were rarely acknowledged or appreciated by those who benefited from this careful planning. The education of young people that took place through observation and participation in these social rituals represented an informal but essential component of elite family reproduction. As children learned through direct experience the complex skills and knowledge that would be required for them to maintain their family's social position when they reached adulthood, the gradual introduction of young people to increasingly sophisticated social situations provided them with opportunities to develop the social intelligence and cultural knowledge that would be essential to their future success, while also allowing families to evaluate and address any deficiencies in their children's social development before they became publicly apparent. The great railway terminals of Victorian London stood like cathedrals of steam and steel, their soaring iron and glass roofs creating spaces that seemed to capture and concentrate the energy of an empire in motion. Yet, within these democratic seeming spaces that appeared to welcome all travelers regardless of social station, complex geography of privilege operated that separated the wealthy from the poor as effectively as any physical barrier, creating parallel worlds of travel experience that rarely intersected despite sharing the same platforms and the same destinations. The first-class carriages that awaited the most privileged passengers represented mobile extensions of elite domestic space, furnished with mahogany paneling, velvet upholstery, and crystal fixtures that provided a level of comfort and luxury that exceeded what many working-class families could hope to achieve in their permanent homes. The private railway companies that served London's wealthiest families had evolved beyond simple transportation providers into comprehensive lifestyle services that managed every aspect of travel from the moment passengers left their homes until they arrived at their destinations, employing staffs of specialized servants who understood that their primary responsibility is not merely to facilitate movement from one place to another, but to ensure that the social status and personal comfort of their elite clientele remained uncompromised by the potentially democratizing experience of public transportation. These railway servants, dressed in liveries that identified them with specific companies and specific levels of service, possessed knowledge of their passengers' personal preferences, family relationships, and social obligations that enabled them to provide a level of personalized attention that transformed the industrial experience of rail travel into something that resembled the hospitality of a grand country house. The engineering that went into creating first-class railway accommodations represented a triumph of Victorian craftsmanship and attention to detail that rivaled the finest furniture and interior design available in London's most exclusive shops, as every surface that passengers might touch or observe was finished to standards that demonstrated the railway companies' understanding that their wealthiest customers possessed the knowledge and experience necessary to distinguish between authentic luxury and mere pretense. The marquetry work that decorated the interior panels of first-class compartments, the hand-carved moldings that framed windows and doorways, and the custom metalwork that adorned handles, hinges, and fixtures all represented investments in craftsmanship that spoke to the economic resources that the railway companies were willing to devote to securing the patronage of customers, whose social influence extended far beyond their individual purchasing power. The social protocols that governed interaction between passengers in first class Accommodations required railway staff to possess k. knowledge of London's complex social hierarchies and the etiquette that governed relationships between individuals of different social ranks, as the confined space of railway carriages could create situations where people who would never normally interact in London society found themselves in close proximity for extended periods. The ability of railway servants to facilitate appropriate introductions, manage potentially awkward social situations, and ensure that the proper forms of courtesy were maintained throughout the journey represented skills that were essential to the success of first-class railway service, but that required training and experience that went far beyond technical knowledge of railway operations. The baggage handling services provided to first-class passengers involved the management of personal possessions that often included items of extraordinary value and sentimental importance, requiring railway staff to understand not only the practical aspects of safe transportation, but also the social and emotional significance of objects that represented family history, artistic achievement, or personal identity. The specialized packing, storage, and handling procedures that railway companies developed for valuable artwork, jewelry, documents, and other precious items reflected their understanding that the loss or damage of such possessions could create consequences that extended far beyond financial compensation. The cultural impact of first-class railway travel extended beyond its immediate effects on the individuals who used these services, as the standards of luxury and service that were established by railway companies influenced expectations and practices throughout London's hospitality and service industries. The innovations in comfort, convenience, and personal attention that were developed to meet the needs of first-class railway passengers found applications in hotels, restaurants, private clubs, and other establishments that served wealthy clientele, creating a general elevation in service standards that benefited all levels of society. Even though the original innovations were developed specifically for elite customers, the economic relationships that sustained first-class railway services involved complex networks of suppliers, craftsmen, service providers, whose livelihoods depended on the continued prosperity and travel habits of London's wealthy families, creating employment opportunities and economic activity that extended far beyond the railway companies themselves. The specialized industries that developed to serve the needs of first-class railway travel, from custom furniture makers to luxury food suppliers to specialized cleaning and maintenance services, represented significant components of London's economy that were largely invisible to the general public, but that provided employment and income for thousands of workers whose skills and expertise were essential to maintaining the standards that wealthy passengers expected. In the grand mansions of London's most exclusive neighborhoods, where marble stairs curved gracefully between floors that housed rooms dedicated to purposes that most of the city's inhabitants could not even imagine. The ultimate luxury was not the imported silk wallpapers, or the crystal chandeliers, or the servants who moved through the halls with silent efficiency, but rather something so fundamental to human existence that its absence in the lives of the poor had become invisible. To those who possessed it in abundance, the simple miracle of clean water that flowed from silver taps at the turn of a handle, carrying with it the promise of cleanliness, comfort, and the possibility of washing away not just physical dirt, but the psychological weight of urban existence that settled like soot on everything and everyone who lived in Victorian London. The bathrooms of the wealthy represented achievements in domestic engineering that rivaled the great public works projects in their complexity and sophistication. Though their benefits were enjoyed by only a handful of individuals rather than entire populations, as these private sanctuaries incorporated the latest advances in plumbing, heating, and water treatment to create environments where the act of bathing was transformed from the utilitarian necessity that it remained for most Londoners into a ritual of personal renewal that could wash away the stresses and contamination of urban life. The marble fixtures, imported from quarries in Italy and Greece, were carved by craftsmen whose skills had been passed down through generations of sculptors, creating surfaces that were not merely functional, but beautiful, transforming the most basic human activities into aesthetic experiences that reflected the owner's sophisticated understanding of luxury and refinement. The engineering required to bring clean water to the upper floors of multi-story mansions represented technical challenges that pushed the boundaries of Victorian hydraulic knowledge. It's the systems of pipes, pumps, and storage tanks that made possible the seemingly effortless flow of hot and cold water on demand required careful calculation of pressure differentials, thermal expansion, and structural load bearing that took into account not only the immediate requirements of water delivery, but also the long-term maintenance needs that would ensure the continued reliable operation of these complex domestic infrastructure systems. The lead pipes that carried water through the walls of these elegant homes, while representing the most advanced plumbing technology available to Victorian engineers, would later be recognized as sources of slow poisoning that gradually damaged the health of those who benefited from their convenience, creating ironic parallels to the more obvious health hazards that threatened London's poor. The hot water systems that provided the luxury of heated baths represented marvels of domestic engineering that required the coordination of multiple technological systems. From the coal-fired boilers that generated steam to heat water to the complex networks of insulated pipes that carried hot water to bathrooms throughout large houses without significant heat loss, creating domestic environments where the simple pleasure of a warm bath could be enjoyed regardless of season or weather conditions outside. The servants whose labor was required to maintain these complex systems worked largely invisibly, stoking boilers in basement rooms, cleaning and maintaining pipes and fixtures, and ensuring that the coal supplies necessary to heat water were always available. It's creating a hidden infrastructure of human effort that made possible the seemingly effortless luxury enjoyed by their employers. The social rituals that surrounded bathing in wealthy households reflected the transformation of personal hygiene from practical necessity into opportunities for personal reflection and social preparation, as the private time spent in elaborately appointed bathrooms provided space for the kind of self-contemplation and mental preparation that was increasingly difficult to find in the busy social schedules that characterized elite London life. The morning bath became a daily ritual of renewal that marked the transition from sleep to social engagement, while evening baths provided opportunities for washing away the accumulated stresses and social obligations of the day, creating personal rhythms that helped to structure daily life around moments of private luxury and personal care. The contrast between the water available to London's wealthy and that accessible to the poor represented one of the most stark illustrations of inequality in a city where disparities in living conditions created parallel worlds that shared the same geographic space while providing radically different opportunities for health, comfort, and human dignity. The crystal clear water that flowed from silver taps in Mayfair mansions had been filtered, treated to remove the impurities and contamination that characterized the water available to working-class families, who often had to choose between water that was expensive and water that was safe, if indeed safe water was available to them at all through the limited public infrastructure that served London's poorest neighborhoods. The architectural integration of sophisticated plumbing systems into the design of London's finest homes required collaboration between architects, engineers, and craftsmen that pushed the boundaries of domestic design while creating new possibilities for privacy and personal comfort that would influence residential architecture for generations. The placement of bathrooms, the routing of pipes through walls and floors, and the coordination of water delivery systems with heating and ventilation systems all required technical expertise and aesthetic sensitivity that demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of domestic comfort that characterized the best Victorian domestic architecture. The international connections that enabled London's wealthy to enjoy such luxury reflected the global networks of trade and exploitation that sustained the British Empire. as the marble for bathroom fixtures was quarried by workers in Mediterranean countries. The lead for pipes was mined in wells by men who would never enjoy the luxury products their labor made possible. And the coal that heated the water was extracted by miners whose working conditions stood in stark contrast to the comfortable domestic environments their efforts helped to create. The global supply chains that brought luxury materials to London's elite households depended on systems of economic inequality that extended far beyond the city's boundaries to encompass much of the known world. The technological innovations that were developed to meet the demands of wealthy households for improved domestic water systems often found broader applications that eventually benefited larger segments of the population, as the engineering solutions devised for private luxury gradually influenced the design of public infrastructure systems that could provide similar benefits on a larger scale. The knowledge gained from constructing and maintaining private water systems has contributed to the expertise that made possible the public works projects that would eventually transform the living conditions of ordinary Londoners. Though this transfer of knowledge often took decades to complete and was driven more by public health crises than by humanitarian concerns for the welfare of the poor, the maintenance requirements of sophisticated domestic plumbing systems created ongoing relationships between wealthy households and the skilled craftsmen whose expertise was essential to keeping these systems functioning properly, generating continuous employment opportunities that provided stable incomes for workers whose specialized knowledge commanded premium wages in London's competitive labor market. The regular inspection, cleaning, and repair work required to maintain private water systems created economic relationships that extended over many years, often passing from one generation to the next as families of craftsmen developed long-term relationships with families of clients who valued reliability and discretion above cost considerations. As you drift toward sleep on this foggy London night, consider the vast distances that separated the experiences of different social classes within the same city. The complex relationships between technology and inequality that shaped daily life, for everyone from the factory worker sharing his bed in shifts to the aristocrat luxuriating in a marble bathtub filled with heated water that had been filtered and treated to perfect purity. The fog that obscured the streets outside served as a metaphor for the social blindness that prevented different classes from seeing each other clearly, creating a city where extraordinary luxury and desperate poverty existed side by side, each largely invisible to the other despite their intimate geographical proximity.